The scripture this evening is from Mark 16, 1-8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. I am so glad we are finally here. This congregation has worked its little heart out during the season of Lent. The musicians, the praise team, the readers, and well, I'm not going to say that. And we're finally here. And we need to be here. I mean, you can only spend so many days pondering the darker moments of humanity. You can only do that for so long. Without help from someone else. This is God's response to our humanity. That there is something deep within each and every one of us that is eternal. And sometimes we forget that. And sometimes we lose sight of that. And sometimes we are so wrapped up in the darker elements of the lives that we have all been called to live that we ignore it. So I am so glad we're here. And now we get 50 days. 50 days to play. 50 days to celebrate. 50 days. Because Easter's 50 days long. Because what God has given us is so generous and so charmed with wonder. One day I'm going to do it. So we got 50. I suppose at the end of the 50 days we'll be so tired of celebrating and playing and praising that we'll look back at Lent as being the good old days where we got to walk around, oh my, didn't life hard. We human beings. But I want to welcome some people from Bowling Green. Jerry Tipton and their family. It was just so nice to see you. It was a nice surprise. Now, occasionally the miners come, and that's not a surprise. But here's a nice surprise. Joe is a good friend of the miners. Now, he'll go call them up and tell them I should have about them. So. But, mom's word, yeah. Jerry's husband, Vaughn, passed away 2 years ago this day. And I just want to tell you about Vaughn, because Vaughn's one of those folks who just inspired me and inspired everybody who got to know him. For over 30 years, way over 30 years, he had a heart condition that was very, very serious. And so essentially he was just living every day, one day at a time. And I can't imagine living every day, one day at a time. But he did. And he not only just lived it, he was always talking about how much he appreciated the life God had given him. And he was an incredible witness for the power of the resurrection to inspire him. And so it's just so nice of you. His last worship service with us, we did the Easter portion of Handel's Messiah that year, and he got to sing in it. And then later that day, he had to go in the hospital. And but what a delightful man, what a gentle soul, and I'm just so pleased this evening. You notice that spring is sort of begrudgingly coming into the, I had a funeral this morning, and I got into the funeral home, and I saw Mr. Shank in the parking lot getting some things ready, and he said, "It's about time." I said, "Oh, I thought I was here early." No, it's spring, And after the funeral, and our women did such a nice job, and it was for Ruth Bell, and what a great family they have, and the music that they had played in the service was just delightful, and it was just and she was 99 years old, and but yet the grief was still, was very much there, but the joy of her life was very much there. And then I get home, I'm going to crash for a little bit, and all the kids in the neighborhood are all out, and they're running up and down the sidewalk. And it was just such a delight to watch them run up and down the sidewalk and just have a great time. And it was still not quite so windy to drive them in-house, but it was just everywhere I saw there were kids. And then my wife tells me I need to go run a few errands, and so I get out in my car. She was going to run some errands, I was going to run some errands, and I get in my car, and I start to pull out the driveway, and I notice in my neighbor's car something odd poking its head out of the wheel well. So I stopped and looked. There was this tiny little bird, this incredibly tiny little bird, making a nest in the wheel well of this car. It was the most delightful thing you could imagine. What a sign of hope, making their home in the springtime, in the wheel of this car. But of course, not all hope works out. Later in the afternoon, the car was gone. So much for that effort. But that's what is so cool about nature. Against the odds, against the odds, it stands up and tries to create new life. And that little bird just sticking its head between the spokes of the wheel, looking out as it was making its nest. I thought, wow, what a great sign for the hope that is found in this season of Easter. But then also the reality that sometimes that hope doesn't get to live itself out. So I had to share that with you because I was just so charmed by that little bird. And I'm also charmed by Mark's gospel. I've always been charmed by Mark's gospel. It's my favorite gospel of the four. And one of the reasons I like Mark's gospel is that his account of the resurrection is so different than the other three. In the other three, the women go to the tomb, and they're going to do their stuff, but they can't because the body's not there anymore. And angels tell them to go back and tell the guys. And so they become the first preachers of the gospel of the resurrection. They become the first preachers of the resurrection, those women. And in Matthew and in Luke and in John, they go do it. But in Mark, they don't. And the reason why they don't is that Mark tells us that they were amazed and afraid. And so the question is, what is it they're afraid of? What is so scary years, when we have done Bible studies with Mark, and I like to ask the question, well, what do you suppose the women are afraid? I used to get the same response. Well, this was something new. And it's easy to be afraid of things that are new. I don't mean to throw a curve here. But in many ways, it's not something that's new. One of my favorite New Testament scholars, a guy named John Dominic Crossan, he's a Roman Catholic, and he writes so well. In one of his books, makes the following argument. People for centuries have encountered moments with loved ones who have passed away. And he goes back and he recounts ancient Greek history and journals that were written by people that had encountered a loved one whom had passed away. Then he talks about, you remember the movie The Perfect Storm? Sebastian Junger's book, based on Sebastian Junger's book. It is about the boat that gets out there and all things go wrong and the boat gets turned over and everybody dies. Junger, thank you. Thank you. I always count on the accountant to make sure. After that happened, a woman wakes in the morning and looks out her window. Her grandson was on that boat. She sees him as clear as day, walking down the street. As clear as day. And furthermore, other people in that community had seen him on the street that morning. How could that be? How could that be? And throughout my career as a pastor, I've had people come into my office and say, Reverend Clay, am I nuts? And I said, what do you mean? And they'll tell me some story about they were in the quiet of the morning, reading, and they looked up, and there was a parent, a husband, a wife. I had one woman come into my office, her 41-year-old son died suddenly of a massive heart failure, 41 years old. Turned out it was some kind of birth defect he had. Never knew he had it. His 9-year-old son found him on the floor when he came home from school. Very, very tragic, very sad. A couple months later, his mother, who was just one of the great, great souls I've had the pleasure of pastoring. She was a teacher. She lived down the street. She called me out. She said, Eric, I got to talk to you. And I said, I'll walk down. So I walked down the street. And she says, I was sitting in John's room, the room that was his when he was a child growing up. And I was crying. And I was sitting in the room. And all of a sudden, the Bible, that was the Bible that the church gave him when he was in 3rd grade, sitting on the nightstand, jumped off the nightstand and fell on the floor. And I tell you, it was solidly on the nightstand. It wasn't on the edge or anything like that. Am I nuts? Is John trying to tell me something? People have encounters. The American Psychiatric Association says this is normal and natural, and we do not treat it as a mental illness or a mental defect. So Dr. Crossan is saying, when Jesus is risen from the dead and starts encountering people, the idea of encountering someone who has lived and died is not a big deal in the first century. And he says it's not a big deal for us. But Jesus' death and resurrection is a big deal. And so he asks the question, what makes his resurrection and those with whom he appears different? And that's the question. And I think that answer to that question is related to the women in Mark's Gospel, who leave because they are afraid. And they tell no one because they're afraid. For whatever reason, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is transformative. The guy who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire blames the fall of the Roman Empire on Jesus, because he touched so many lives and made them peaceful. Touched so many lives and created a sense of fairness and justice that thuggish need to be in control got weakened over time. And so Rome fell. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is transformational. Things change when we are in the midst of its grace and power. The problem is, and I don't need to tell you this is not something I'm telling you that you don't know. We really don't like change very well. You know? We like to get set in our ways. We like to get comfortable in our ways. We like to sort of hold on to our views of things, our prejudices, our attitudes. We don't like it when someone comes and starts messing with those things. And the thing about the women, they're going to the tomb and they have a job to do. They didn't get it finished on Friday afternoon because it was getting too close for the Sabbath. And so they had to just make a temporary burial site, then come back after the Sabbath was over to finish preparing the body for its final resting. And yes, they are grieving, horribly grieving the loss of Jesus because they loved him greatly. And I don't mean to be crass when I say this, but there's a reality about humanity. Sometimes death is comforting. When someone we love dies, we get to control everything about that person. Our memories, the stories we tell, what that person was like, how that person lived. We get to control all that. And so often people will remember wonderful things about a person who was a wonderful man or a wonderful woman. And sometimes people will remember horrible things about a person who was a jerky person. And we get to control all that. And they don't get any say in it. We get to live our lives with our memories, but they no longer have any control over us. Their influence is in a different place. If Jesus stays dead, we get to control Jesus. We could remember him the way we want to remember him, and we could tell people what Jesus wants us to do. And we can do it without reflecting or anything. But the old rascal is still around. He's a force to be reckoned with. If Jesus survives this death experience and makes himself available to those who love him, we no longer get to live with the idea that we get to control him. And we no longer get to be comfortable in what we are, because he's going to change us. He's going to transform us. He's going to make us new. And I don't know about you, but I'm, at the age of 63, pretty comfortable in my ways. Pretty cozy in my thoughts. And the idea that come Easter, I got to deal with this guy who's bent on making me a better human being. And to remind me that I am loved. And to remind me that you are loved. And because you are loved, I have to treat you like the blessing you are. And he wants to change my heart so that doesn't become an obligation, but just an extension of who I am. That's been my struggle my entire life. This Jesus character, wanting to make me more humane, loving, just. And I'm always cocky enough to think I'm humane enough, and loving enough, and just enough. So it's no wonder the women are scared. It's no wonder. It's not that they're afraid that something supernatural has happened, because people encounter this stuff all the time. Is that this character, released from the grave, means to make us whole. Wants so much more for us than what we want. Know that you are loved. Have a happy Easter. Christ is risen. Thanks be to God.